The auction hall was packed. Investors in expensive suits sat in the front rows. Farm owners whispered among themselves. Businessmen checked their phones and studied the auction documents. Everyone had come for one reason: to buy the remains of Blackwood Industrial Works. The company had gone bankrupt after years of debt. Its massive welding factory, equipment, warehouses, trucks, and surrounding industrial land were all being sold to the highest bidder. Nobody expected a poor-looking welder to become the most important person in the room, until the doors opened. A man slowly walked inside. His name was Robert Carter. He was 40 years old. He wore an old brown jacket, faded work trousers, and worn-out boots. In one hand was a metal walking cane. Robert had lost one leg years earlier in an industrial accident. He had survived, but the accident had changed his life forever. He could no longer walk normally. He couldn't work the way he once had. And the company he had worked for had eventually let him go. But Robert never stopped welding. He opened a tiny workshop behind his house. There, using old equipment, he repaired farm machinery, trailers, gates, pipes, and industrial equipment. He wasn't wealthy. At least, that's what everyone thought. As Robert entered the auction hall, several people recognized him. One investor laughed. "Look who's here." Another man whispered, "Isn't that the disabled welder?" A third man looked at Robert's old clothes. What could he possibly want here? Someone laughed. Robert heard them. He didn't respond. He simply walked to the back of the room and sat down. Across the hall, a wealthy businessman named Victor Hale noticed him. Victor owned several industrial companies. He had millions of dollars. And he had already decided that Blackwood Industrial Works would belong to him. Victor looked at Robert and smiled. "Robert." Robert looked up. Victor pointed at the auction floor. "You know this isn't a charity event, right?" A few people laughed. Robert calmly replied, "I know." Victor smiled. "Good." Then he leaned closer. "Because whatever you're planning to buy, I hope you brought enough money." Robert looked at him. "I did." Victor laughed. But he didn't know what Robert had brought, and he certainly didn't know why Robert had come. The auctioneer stepped onto the platform. His name was Richard Miller. He raised his microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Blackwood Industrial Bankruptcy Auction." The room became quiet. Richard began with smaller equipment: welding machines, generators, compressors, industrial tools, old trucks. One by one, everything was sold. Robert remained silent. He didn't bid. People began noticing. He hasn't bought anything. Maybe he came just to watch. Victor smiled. Then the auctioneer announced the next item. Lot number 17. A large industrial welding system appeared on the screen. This equipment was valued at over $100,000 when new. The bidding began. $20,000. Another bidder raised his paddle. $25,000. Robert slowly lifted his paddle. The auctioneer looked surprised. Bidder 47. $30,000. The bidding continued. 35,000s. Robert, 40,000s. 45,000s. Robert, 50,000s. Nobody else continued. The auctioneer slammed the hammer. Sold. Robert had won. People looked at him. Someone whispered, "Why would he spend $50,000 on an old welding system?" Victor smiled. Let him waste his money. Robert didn't react. He knew exactly what he was doing, because the welding system wasn't the reason he had come. It was only the beginning. Several hours passed. The auction room became increasingly tense. Most of the smaller assets had already been sold. Then Richard picked up his final document. His voice changed. "Ladies and gentlemen," everyone became quiet. "We have reached the final asset of today's auction." A photograph appeared on the massive screen. The room erupted in whispers. Blackwood Industrial Works, the entire facility, the factory, the warehouses, the welding workshops, the offices, the equipment yard, and nearly 200 acres of industrial land. The opening bid was announced. $5 million. Victor immediately raised his paddle. $6 million. Another investor answered. 6.5. Victor, $7 million. The other investor, 7.5. Victor, $8 million. The room became silent. The other investor lowered his paddle. Richard looked around. $8 million. Victor smiled. He believed he had won. Then Robert raised his paddle. The entire room froze. Richard stared at him. Bidder 47. Robert calmly said, $8.5 million. The room exploded with whispers. Victor turned around. His smile disappeared. You? Robert said nothing. Victor raised his paddle. $9 million. Robert, 9.5. Victor, $10 million. Robert, 10.5. Victor stared at him. Where are you getting this money? Robert looked at him. You don't need to know. Victor laughed nervously. You're a welder. Robert nodded. Yes. Victor shook his head. You can't possibly afford this. Robert raised his paddle again. $11 million. The room became completely silent. Victor looked at his financial advisors. They whispered urgently. The auctioneer asked, Do we have $11.5 million? Victor slowly raised his paddle. 11.5. Robert, $12 million. A gasp moved through the crowd. Victor's face became red. 12.5. Robert, $13 million. Victor hesitated. His advisors were shaking their heads. Mr. Hale, we have reached our limit. Victor clenched his jaw. He looked at Robert. The disabled welder sat calmly in his chair. No fear, no hesitation, no excitement, just confidence. Victor raised his paddle. 13.5 million. Robert looked toward the auctioneer. Then he raised his paddle one final time. 14 million. Silence. Victor froze. He couldn't continue. The auctioneer looked around. $14 million. Nobody moved. Going once. Silence. Going twice. Victor stared at Robert. Sold. The hammer slammed down. Bang. The entire room erupted. Robert Carter had won Blackwood Industrial Works, the man everyone had laughed at, the handicapped welder, the man who arrived in worn-out boots. He had just purchased a $14 million industrial. People crowded around Robert. Who are you? Where did you get the money? How could a welder afford $14 million? Robert remained quiet. Then Richard, the auctioneer, approached him. Mr. Carter, I have to ask. Robert looked at him. How did you prepare for this? Robert smiled. I've been preparing for 11 years. The room became quiet again. Victor stepped forward. 11 years? Robert nodded. Yes. Victor looked confused. What aren't we seeing? Robert reached into his jacket. He pulled out an old photograph. It showed a much younger Robert standing beside a welding machine. Victor stared at the photograph. Then Robert spoke. 11 years ago, I worked here. The room went silent. Robert pointed toward the factory on the screen. I helped build this company. Victor's expression changed. Robert continued. I designed some of the welding systems they used. I trained their workers. I repaired their machines, and I worked 16-hour days to keep this place running. Everyone listened. Then Robert told them what happened. One afternoon, a machine malfunctioned. A heavy steel structure collapsed while Robert was working beneath it. He survived, but he lost his leg. After the accident, Blackwood's management told him he couldn't work anymore. They fired him. Robert left the company with almost nothing. He returned home. He thought his life was finished. But then something changed. He started welding again, from a tiny workshop behind his house. At first, he repaired farm gates, then trailers, then tractors, then industrial machines. His reputation spread. Farmers came from neighboring towns. Factories began hiring him. And Robert started building his own welding equipment. He patented several designs. One of his machines became extremely successful. Companies began buying his technology. Robert invested the money. He bought farmland. He invested in manufacturing companies. He built warehouses. He bought industrial properties, quietly, without telling anyone. By the time Blackwood collapsed, Robert was worth far more than anyone in the auction hall realized. He hadn't come to the auction hoping to get lucky. He had come prepared to buy back the place that had once rejected him. Victor looked at Robert. So, this was revenge? Robert shook his head. No. Victor looked confused. Then why buy this place? Robert looked through the window toward the old factory. Because I know what this place can become. He paused. When I worked here, this factory had hundreds of workers. He looked around. People had jobs. Families depended on this company. The community depended on it. Robert continued. I didn't buy it to destroy it. I bought it to rebuild it. 3 months later, Blackwood Industrial Works reopened. But it was different. Robert replaced the broken equipment. He renovated the workshops. He hired former employees. He gave jobs to young mechanics. And he created a training program for disabled workers who had been rejected by other companies. The same factory that had once told Robert he was no longer useful now employed hundreds of people. Robert even created a special welding program. People with disabilities were trained to operate modern welding equipment. One afternoon, Victor visited the factory. He found Robert standing beside a massive welding machine. Victor smiled. You really did it. Robert looked around. No. He pointed toward the workers. We did. Victor looked at Robert's cane. I owe you an apology. Robert nodded. You do. Victor laughed. I thought you were poor. Robert smiled. I was. Victor looked surprised. Robert continued. But being poor isn't the same as being powerless. Victor nodded slowly. Robert turned toward the factory. I lost my leg. He paused. But I didn't lose my ability to dream. Years later, the story of Robert Carter became famous throughout the region. People still remembered the bankruptcy auction. They remembered the laughter. They remembered the man with the cane, sitting quietly in the back. They remembered Victor Hale, trying to outbid him. But most importantly, they remembered the final bid, $14 million. The bid that changed everything. Robert never forgot that day. Not because he had won, but because it taught him something. People will judge you by what they can see. They will see your clothes, your circumstances, your failures, your disability, your past. And sometimes they will laugh. But they cannot see what you're building in silence. They cannot see the knowledge in your mind. They cannot see the discipline in your heart. They cannot see the years of preparation behind your success. Robert walked into that bankruptcy auction looking like a man who had lost everything. But he walked out as the owner of the company that had once rejected him. He didn't win because people felt sorry for him. He won because he had prepared. He had worked. He had learned. He had failed. And he refused to quit. So remember this. Never judge someone's future by their present circumstances. The person everyone laughs at today may be the person writing the biggest success story tomorrow. And sometimes, the final bid isn't just a number. Sometimes, it's the moment a person finally proves that their story isn't over. Like, share, subscribe, and also follow us for stories like this.